Good morning, Mr. Nader. How are you doing, sir?
Good morning, Ross. Always a pleasure. Doing well. I hope you're doing well too.
Likewise, I'm doing okay. But our country is not doing so good.
No, it's not.
It's not doing so good. So, as far as I'm concerned, we have two bad infections, impacting our country. We had the COVID and still have it. And we have racism, civil unrest. My thing is, COVID is a new virus impacting our country, but racism is not. Okay. So, Mr. Nader, let's start with updates about the COVID-19.
Sure, but you're right. Our nation, to take on a major regional, national, or global, issue of the day, of the time, is in itself very serious. But as you stated so correctly, we're dealing with two major diseases or illnesses that society in our nation has been impacted big time. And on the initial front, we have now going into some 4 months of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And I recall in April 1st, New York State was really at a time where we're just beginning to see a few cases of COVID-19. And we in the Assembly at the time had voted for the state budget. And some of us in the Assembly and in the nation really felt, this is a situation we'll conquer, we shouldn't worry as much. And some of us, including myself, were becoming very concerned. And when we found out how this virus spreads and how easy it spreads and how it's already in New York and it was moving into other urban segments of the state like Yonkers that impacts my district and my constituents, we were concerned that whether or not the state is moving in the proper fashion to curb the spread of the disease. And some will argue that New York was delayed, and as a result, there was many cases, an increase in cases, and also deaths, and the whole issue of nursing homes and whether we took proper action or not. But, when I look today, and I was looking at the latest numbers on the national scene, nearly 1.82 million people in America. And this is, even though New York is on the swing down, there's many regions in the country that are still experiencing the upward spikes. So, to have over 1.8 million Americans that are impacted by this virus, and my latest numbers, we're approaching 110,000 deaths in the United States. And we in New York, we knew we were in the epicenter. We were in the midst of it. We're looking at some 375,000 cases in New York State and over 24,000 deaths in New York State. And people say, well, Yonkers, what impact? Yonkers, we're looking close to 7,000 people that have been infected. And now we're increasing testing. A few weeks ago, the state put a testing site at the old Yonkers General Hospital location. And yesterday, the state put an additional testing at the St. Peter's School in Southwest Yonkers. That's a recognition. What we've been saying and seeing all along is that whenever you have urban districts and you have people claim that districts, the poorer districts, have a growing or higher number percentage, that's because many times families of 6 or 7 or 8 and more individuals live in a small apartment. It's very difficult to have social distancing. So even though the numbers are going down, the reason I mentioned the update and the increases is so that, the notice is out there loud and clear when it comes to coronavirus, COVID-19, we should proceed cautiously. It's great that the numbers are going down, the numbers in the hospitals are going down, we're addressing many of the issues, more of the public at large has taken the warning seriously. I see a lot more people in the streets wearing their mask and making sure that they're staying distance and so forth. So to a large extent, that's working. The weather is helping us, but we know that the potential for this disease to spike is really there. So as we address our present situation, which includes the reopening of New York State and the rest of the country, and it comes in phases, and we're in the first phase in the Mid-Hudson region. We're approaching next week the second phase where we can start opening businesses. We're planning to see what we want to do with colleges and for schools, for example, for September. There's a lot going on, but at the same time, all of us still understand there's a lot of uncertainty with this pandemic and this virus, and all of us are waiting, hopefully, for a vaccine. So I hear of a lot of promising trials and results, and there's a number of very well-known pharmaceutical companies that are in the process of coming out with what they claim is positive results. So we keep our fingers crossed, and we hope that, from the pandemic, we can all keep the numbers down, avoid any increases as we become back to some sense of normality, that we don't overdo it, whether it's sport events, whether it's going into restaurants, whether we go shopping, any event we do, we got to continue to realize, we're not out of the woods yet. Thank God it's decreased tremendously, but we still got to be very cautious. So that's really the update on the pandemic. And I know the next part, which is really crucial for you and I and everyone, is really the issue impact in our nation, with the racism and the tolerance and what's going on today.
Well, Mr. Nader, we are working very hard on the antidote for the pandemic. We've been infected with racism in the United States and many parts of the world, but we talk about United States for many, many, many years, 400, and we don't have an antidote to that yet. We don't have a vaccine for it yet. We are continuing to suffer from that today. I see the civil unrest, and and by the way, let me point out that I'm very proud of how the youth in Yonkers, of course, there is pockets of people that are disorderly, but we're not going to mix. Just the same way that we don't call every white man a racist just because there is a few that are racist. So let's not call all the protesters rioters just because there are some that are. So I'm very proud of how the youth in Yonkers projected themselves, very proud of how they articulated themselves, very proud of how they engaged with the police department, city hall, elected officials about their concern. But what puzzles me, sir, is that this is nothing new. This is not something that we just found out that we have racism. We make these big protests as we go around, we lay down on the street. Haven't we done that before? Hasn't promises been made about that before? Didn't they tell us that things were going to change before? We are at exactly the same place as we were on the last killing, not on the last, on the prior killings, maybe of 5 years ago. All those things were talked about. What makes this time different than the ones prior?
Well, you bring up a good point, and I like you started off with the analogy of we don't have an antidote, we don't have a vaccine, and really it said that you have to resort, when we deal with a virus and there's no other way to really stop it than to develop a vaccine that can kill it. We're dealing with a serious social justice matter. And when we look at the global issue and regional and conflicts throughout the world that to a large extent are based on religious differences or ethnic differences or racial differences or political differences, we look at our nation and we look at our history, And we know, many of us that study history look back at America and the days of slavery and what took place. And we look at when Abraham Lincoln in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation Act, and it freed us from slavery. You know, it took nearly 40 years during the period of Jim Crow and regions of the nation that accepted these social changes and political changes, and regions of the nation that did not. And that whole Jim Crow period in our history was really a sad ordeal. And it took many years later till we got to the early 1960s with the rise of the civil rights movement and the days of Dr. Martin Luther King. And we started, you know, to see some resemblance of protest where masses were taken to the streets, masses of not only African Americans. When I look even at the days of Dr. Martin Luther King's march, and I see, you know, whites and blacks and Hispanics and Asians and people of color marching together, that was a message that our nation had a serious disease and we needed to change that disease. And there was progress in the 1960s. We at the time as a nation, and I recall those days watching on TV, entire cities, neighborhoods were burnt down in Detroit and other areas. And that was really at the time a rude awakening that we hoped would really provide us with enough initiative and enough purpose and reason to say, let's continue to build on that positive. Let's get rid of racial injustice and cure this disease we have. And the last 5 years, I think all of us, you know, with the most recent killing of George Floyd, you know, many of us, even the many law enforcement officials that I spoke to, where in the past there might have been some hesitation where, well, let's see what the circumstances are. Let's see what the person did, whether the cop had a reason or didn't have a reason. But universally, what I've listened to people say is, this is outrageous. This is uncalled for. How dare this person do what he or she did? In this case, a police officer from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And then we find that this police officer had some 19 infractions in his record that deal with either brutality related or racially related or prejudice related. And, you know, many of us begin to say, well, is that a pattern among law enforcement? And then when we study it more, we realize that to a large extent, and I believe so, as you said earlier, that most police officers, and especially the last 20, 30 years in my experience of watching how the Yonkers Police Department has come along, there's been more hiring of minorities. Some of the new hiring practices are more reflective of the communities that they serve. You know, when I look at the new recruits, and my office as an assemblyman, we try to show recognition for the new recruits. We do special certificates, we make presentations, and I look at the names, I look at the backgrounds, and I try to reflect, are we moving in the right direction? We are moving in the right direction. And I've witnessed during, as you said, these protests, and I attended the protests Yonkers had on Sunday, very peaceful, over 1,000 individuals that participated. And you're right, largely a youth movement. And when I look at the faces of the youth that are protesting, in my opinion, it's reflective of the entire community. These are young men and women that are of all faiths and all colors and all creeds and all ethnicities. And you look at the faces and they're standing there saying to their parents and grandparents and society, enough of this nonsense. You know, let's develop. And if it means that there has to be agitation, and if it means there has to be civil unrest to really get the message across, for people to realize that haven't we yet learned from history? Haven't we yet realized that we live in a country, a society, our constitution tells us to be civil, to be respectful of each other, to protect each individual's rights, civil rights and social rights and religious rights and all other rights. And this is why this movement, although some people are concerned about what we see out there, the vandalism and the looting, I share the opinion that that's really separate. And yes, we all agree in any situation, different groups take different courses, different actions, sometimes for their own purposes. But I know from looking at the Yonkers protest, and I've spoken to the police commissioner after the protest, and I said, well, was there any arrest in Yonkers during that first day with more than 1,000 people? And the police commissioner told me that there was not a single arrest. So it was peaceful. And
well, Mr. Nader, allow me to interject something, because I'm seeing a lot of questions. What you're saying is correct. There was no arrests, but the problem, like I said earlier, did not start last Monday. It started long ago.
Yeah.
The hugs, the kisses, the understanding, the changes, the promise of changes. To many people, and I'm asking questions not because I have them, but this is questions that come to me on emails. All that we've seen it before. Every time there is a crisis of this magnitude, we hear police talking about changes. But this is not just about the laws. This is not just about repealing 58A. This is about a mindset. Okay. Do we need the law to say that a police officer should not suffocate a man to death? Do we really need that, sir?
Yeah.
Do we need to say, look, if there is 3 other cops and one of them thinks that whatever that one is doing, that he should stop that person, do we need the law for that?
No, you don't.
Look, in the midst of all this thing that it's going on, the civil unrest, that we are talking about police brutality, in the midst of it, we see cops, including a black cop, tasing and pulling 2 students from a car, because they thought he was armed. Turned out that he wasn't. So in the midst of everything, they continue to do the same. And again, I'm talking about police in general. I'm not talking about Yonkers Police Department, because we haven't seen none of that. Yes, some people are upset with the ways Yonkers Police Department does, but that's normal, okay? We're not going to be happy with everything they do. Even Commissioner Mueller has said to me personally, there is improvements that need to be made.
Correct.
But we have not seen that level of police brutality in Yonkers. There has been allegations, but we haven't seen that level. So do we really need laws to say, listen, you cannot beat somebody. Your job is not to be police, judge, executioner. You just enforce the laws and let the other branch deal with what should be the penalty for it. Do we actually need laws, sir?
Well, no, the common sense answer is, no, you don't need laws. That should be part of society's approach or human nature, the way we deal with each other, which should be based on respect and doing what is proper. But unfortunately, in society in general, there's always a few that for whatever reason don't believe they have to. And in those cases, sometimes you have to put laws in place that tell a person, whether it's a department or whatever capacity, that there's a procedure to follow, there's expectations, there's an accountability and process. We have that in every profession. We tell medical doctors what we expect of them. We tell teachers what we expect. We have accountability. We look at test scores. We look at results and so forth. And law enforcement is no different. Law enforcement, is a serious function in society, because they're meant and they're put in place to protect us. And when we as a public at large see that some segments of law enforcement truly don't protect us, and they use the power of the badge or the power of the gun to really, for whatever reason, override what is socially just and acceptable, then we need to interfere. We need a system in place that allows us to say, you know what, the same way we're looking at teachers each year and looking at their test scores and looking at school districts and monitoring and sometimes making changes because someone doesn't address or respect the need to give a child the best education. The same in law enforcement. As we said earlier, I really believe in a police department like Yonkers, and I mentioned the fact that there was no arrest because there has been. And I remember from 20 years ago, even as a community member, the Yonkers Police Department reached out to me to say, well, with the new recruits that are coming in, what kind of training should we give new police officers? And I responded that Yonkers is very ethnically and racially diversified, and many cultures and many individuals react differently to law enforcement. Some cultures, including my culture, when a law enforcement official, a person of authority, talks to someone, it's almost a show of respect to not lift your eyes up, to keep your eyes down because you're showing respect, looking up and being defiant in some ways. And I know law enforcement officials that sometimes escalated situations and arrested individuals, and it caused outrage in the community when it could have been avoided. So those type of training, even training law enforcement officials had to deal with not only young adults, but adults that have autism. When a police officer stops a person with autism that not intentional, but they have a difficult time comprehending or following directives, some law enforcement officials that don't recognize that may overreact and then escalate in a situation where there's a confrontation and an arrest. So from my end, and that's using my educational experience, you're aware I've been an educator for 40 years before my assembly days, and I dealt with schools heavily in urban school districts. And I focused on making sure minorities had their education in place. I made sure that support services were in place. Biggest issue impacting all professions and our children, but also adults and law enforcement is mental illness or the services that we should be providing in addition to professional development for law enforcement, being that we're focusing. Do certain members of the law enforcement community need mental services or counseling? Did this officer who basically murdered George Floyd, anybody that watched that video, that was a murder there. And I'm glad that he was not only fired, but there was charges pressed against him because that's terrible. That is terrible. That takes away 30 years of progress. But the problem, it wasn't just George Floyd. Ahmaud Arbery became an issue. We haven't gotten over the Eric Gardner issue. We haven't gotten over the Trayvon Martin issue. So as you said earlier, the disease has been boiling, and to the point where you have a generation predominantly of young people saying, which direction are we going? And these are young people that really mobilize this movement, and although some people may tend to look at what has happened negatively, and we know, and even the protest organizers saying, that's a separate thing. We don't tolerate this. And I respect that. And I really feel that society in general, it starts with legislation from Washington. And even though you're right, common sense, we don't have to have rules, but in some cases, we have to have rules. So even though our goal is to do it the common way by showing peaceful coexistence, by providing multicultural education at all levels of education, by providing professional development to teachers and to healthcare workers and to law enforcement officials, and teaching law enforcement officials how to deal with children and how to put race aside and put a person's color aside or a person's ethnicity. And I grew up in Southwest Yonkers, and I tell individuals all the time, my upbringing, died fatherless at a very young age, 8 siblings, lived in a small apartment, shined shoes when I was 6, 7 years old in Southwest Yonkers. So I understand, especially being an Arab American after 9/11, the stigma against a person, and sometimes it could be very traumatic. So I feel for the many young individuals, for the parents that are very terrified about their young children of color being concerned about being targeted or, God forbid, killed because of the color of their skin.
Now, Mr. Nader, let me go back because, your statement is so long that by the time I want to make a point, we already too far from my point.
So I'll do short statements.
Yes, that way we can go back and forth.
Thanks.
Mr. Nader, this happened 8 days ago.
Yeah.
Or 9 days ago. We still have 3 police officers that have not been charged. Police commissioners, police chiefs, everyone is out speaking and saying that was a clear case of murder. 3 police officers still have not been charged. Police departments very often say that they arrest people in their communities and prosecute them in a way, not just to prosecute them, but in a way to set examples for others around them, saying like, listen, what you did is not acceptable. The community expects the same thing from police officers. Why aren't they arrested immediately to set examples to other police officers who often use police brutality and say, listen, if you do this, it's not going to be accepted. And this is what's going to happen to you. But they hide behind the badge. They don't prosecute. They need more evidence. They need to do investigations. They need to do all those things. Look, those riots, which I'm not condoning, didn't take them too much to do an investigation to see that they broke into a store.
Yeah.
But when it happens to law enforcement, it's an investigation that takes months and months, and sometimes years. We need
to change that. We need to change that. And that's why new laws, new policy, new training, like 50A is a policy that you've mentioned earlier. We in the New York State Assembly are looking at that. The Assembly, the Senate, the governor. Some people would say, it should be a norm without laws. And I agree. Common sense is a law enforcement official is there to protect us. When they do a wrongdoing, they should be punished similar to any other profession. This is like a teacher that commits sex abuse on a child or emotional trauma. We take immediate action to terminate, bring them out of the situation. The way the system is and the way the laws are, there's certain protections in place that sometimes, in our opinion, sometimes are outrageous because they allow individuals that are corrupt and brutal to really go on longer than they should without being immediately punished. I believe in a process that allows an individual due process rights, so if it's not pretty obvious of my sense of guilt as an individual, then they deserve maybe to some extent protections that allows the process to see to what extent they're guilty and to what extent are they guilty and what are they deserving of as far as punishment. And you want to make sure that the system you put in place is equitable, that it applies to all. Now, in the case of the officer that committed the murder, that was pretty clear. The second level is the other 3 officers, and I agree, that should have taken an action and should have said to this guy, he's handcuffed and there's 4 of us here. Do what we normally do. Put him in the back seat of the car and lock the car till we deal with the issue. There was no reason whatsoever. So are they grossly negligent in homicide? Potentially. But I agree with you that these processes, although should be common, you got to have changes in the way we deal with the law. And 50A is really one of those laws that doesn't apply in every state in the nation, but it does in New York, that gives additional protection to law enforcement. Now, I understand some law enforcement activities, for example, where a police officer lives and their residence, maybe that information we should be sensitive where if they're dealing with drug-related activity or criminal activity and they arrest individuals, there's certain protections that may be necessary. But the record, somebody's record of brutality or somebody's record of disrespect for their duty or somebody's racial motives, and if that plays a role with their official duties, then yes, that should not be protected. So some individuals are saying, let's look at 50A. Does it need modifications? Does it need to be changed and overhaul? You know, I'm one of the individuals that definitely believes there should be modifications. Let's look at it. And if we need to change it in general, that's an option too. But you hate to feel that in order to promote change, you got to put laws in place, because I agree with you. That has to be a society matter. That has to be something that we educate, something that we hoped by this time the nation, you know, in my opinion, did a great thing. It wasn't just African Americans that elected Barack Obama. It was a coalition of peoples from all colors that elected Barack Obama based on his intellectual abilities, his ability to lead. And he did an outstanding job. So now you look at this wave that brings us back, you know, to the pre-1960s civil unrest and the civil rights movement, really is very upsetting. It's really not only upsetting, it's traumatic. And if I'm dealing with the people I'm dealing with, I got to tell you, from law enforcement and political leaders and community leaders, you know, there's a big tendency to say this experience was very traumatic. It wasn't necessary. We got to change it. And, you know, and people had an open mind. When I looked at the news last night, I was watching Channel 7 late, and I got to tell you, the amount of law enforcement, you know, police officers in various cities that took the knee and that were hugging with the protesters and marching with them, that's a good start. And I go back to Yonkers and proud of the fact.
Mr. Nader, I'm sorry. I have to. I know that you want to tell me all those things, but I have to ask you the questions that the people want to know the answers for. All this hugging, all this kneeling. Some people say this is just theatrics. Okay, you give it a month or two, and I don't want to be negative, but yeah. I want to tell you what the people are saying. Okay, I want you to get. I don't want to sugarcoat these and tell you, look, we all like the kneeling. No, what we want is mind change. Okay, you just mentioned that Barack Obama and all that, but we remember someone saying about 40 years ago that we're going to make America great again.
Yeah.
Are we making America great again? Now, I have to throw something at you. When I say at you, I don't mean you personally. I mean elected officials.
Sure.
Do you take responsibility in part for the things that are going on? Because those laws are made by legislators like you.
Right.
Do you need somebody to be killed in a way that not just George Floyd, many others have been killed in order to say enough is enough? What about taking a little bit of a proactive, okay, measurements to prevent another George Floyd, okay, 5 years from now, and forget about George Floyd, Andrew, the lady, the Andrew Diablo, and a whole bunch of other. Why do we need something like that in order to talk about it? What about legislators like you, senators, congressmen, elected officials step up and say, now, we need to change something. We don't need 400 years for this. Look how quick they are working on COVID-19. Why is it? Because it impacts money, it impacts the economy. What about hundreds of Black people that have been killed by police unjustifiably? Isn't that a pandemic? Isn't that a virus that we need to address? Why find justifications? Why pass the buck? What about say, no, we elected officials have done wrong. We need to change, and we need to change it now, sir. Not 6 months from now, now. We need to convey, get together, get in the chambers and make laws that will protect the people.
And you're right. But my answer to that is that, I happen to be a legislator in New York State, and I happen to be a legislator from what I consider the New York City metropolitan area, which includes New York City, Westchester, Long Island, the surrounding area. And over the last 5 years, I really say, kudos or credit to the New York State legislator and the governor and the establishment in New York. With a lot of friction, we've taken a very progressive agenda. So when you say, what has public officials, I can tell you, speaking on behalf of predominantly Democrat public officials in my district and beyond, as I said, that have over the last 10 years have taken a more greater responsibility and a hold on how New York State rules. And if you look at the policies the last 10 years, especially the last 5 years, it's been a tremendous turnaround on changing policies, dealing with social issues, dealing with social justice, with equality, with a women's right, with protecting immigrants and minorities and so forth. If you look at the policies coming out of New York State, predominantly from a Democrat-controlled legislation that only recently, the last couple of years, has been shifted completely, where we're passing legislation, progressive legislation, and even now the exploration of the 50A changing is coming across heavily from the ranks of Democrat legislators. This is real productive, reactive change. And I got to tell you, when I speak to legislators and people, similar capacities in California and in Illinois and Texas and New Jersey and elsewhere, they'll say, what? We've been following New York State. You guys in New York State have taken the responsibility. You've taken the lead. I mean, since 2 years ago, with the rise of, even right from Yonkers, New York, Andrea Stewart Cousins becoming the majority leader of the New York State Senate, that was the first time that we truly had the ability to move a lot of legislation, where the assembly was predominantly Democrat, the state Senate now is Democrat, you have a Democrat governor. Was there some still obstacles? Yes, there's always obstacles in government, and there's always forces in our community, in our society, that keep pushing back on change, because we understand for a lot of individuals, change may be difficult. But as you said, when change is necessary, you need to be proactive. You need to put forth initiatives. And at times, even though you'd like it to happen gradually and with common sense and goodness attached to it, sometimes it has to be policy, where you have to say, this is the rules, this is the procedure. If you have a job to do, this is how you should conduct your job. And racism and injustice should never be part of any job, not only law enforcement. As you said earlier, this is a society matter. This is something that needs to be addressed on a wide spectrum. As I said earlier, I've said there's a need for education, and education not just for pre-K to 12. We need extensive diversity training to continue in colleges. We need that to continue in the workplace, in all employment sectors, where it becomes part of an initiative that the country on the whole takes from every segment to say, you know what, we got to put a stop to this nonsense. And I really believe law enforcement in general, whether some people in the field like it or not, are realizing that this injustice is real and it can't continue. And when I see, individuals speak up, and as you said, sometimes is it just to say what's politically correct at the time and so forth? But I think a lot of individuals mean it. Well, we got to make sure that this continues to be a topic that's addressed on a regular basis, that we need to continue to motivate dialogue. We need to make sure that, law enforcement officials have expanded community outreach services, the whole process that we know in Yonkers of the hand and shake, where a few years ago, it encouraged officers to be on the streets and to intermingle with members of the community. I'd like to see part of every academy training a more extensive diversity training, where there's instances where there's situations where potential police brutality, and to really teach all our young recruits. It should be not just in Yonkers, New York. There should be a national attempt to get the federal government involved to pass legislation that requires a certain curriculum that experts that understand the trauma, understand the field, can put forth this curriculum, and to make it mandatory, and legally authorized for law enforcement to have this extensive, I'm not talking about an hour or 2 hours in the academy and let it go by. There should be field experiences. They should have community service involvement on a regular basis, where law enforcement officials are encouraged a certain part of their time to be at senior citizen centers, at neighborhood community centers, at senior centers, at schools, to go and work with high school kids and promote. What I remember when I was a principal, I had numerous police come into my buildings to promote a better respect and understanding between officers. We had the McGruff program. We had the drug-free zone program, where police officers came into buildings, and we had career days where, we had officers working with kids and encouraging. I believe that the makeup of law enforcement, especially in urban communities, must be reflective of the makeup of the community. You want to make sure that the individuals that are providing protection and law enforcement should be reflective of the community they're serving. And I say that for education. I was a big advocate of, from years ago, that a city like Yonkers, the makeup of the teaching population has to be reflective of the student population. And when I was on the Board of Education, put a lot of attempt on making sure that when we hired individuals, we gave special consideration to individuals that are bilingual, individuals that are multiracial, multicultural, and that provided us at least with a new teaching body at all levels that can look at a child, and a child can feel, wow, I can feel a sense of protection, a sense of trust and sincerity. And there's no difference with law enforcement. And I think in talking to the commissioner and others, I see there's an openness there. So it's our job to motivate members of the community to become police officers, firemen, teachers, and other professions.
Well, Mr. Nader, let's hope we can motivate them before somebody else dies. Okay.
Exactly.
Now, yes, you are right. I know that a lot of the elected officials mean what they're saying. I have heard the police commissioner, Yonkers Police Commissioner John Mueller, speak in many occasions. And that is one thing that he said, he has said multiple times, and it really impacted me. He said that police officers should act when doing an arrest in the same way as they would like to be done if it was one of their family members. I heard him saying that multiple times, and I believe him. But just like sometimes I might say something to my wife, what she hears is not what I'm saying. She hears it differently. Now, my parallel is, do the police officers in Yonkers hear what Mr. John Mueller is saying? Because many of them, the words that comes from Mr. Mueller and the way they act on the street, is like there is a disconnect. Okay, and let me point out that I know many police officers on the streets, and they are exceptional people. They have a tough job to do. I understand they have a tough job to do. I understand sometimes I get on their nerves. Sometimes they get on my nerves, okay? But it's part of the job. But there is some that go the extra mile to arrest the people that they are supposed to serve. And no one knows about it. No one talks about it. We need to start exposing that. We need to create a filter. We need to create a filter to identify those that abuse the badge that they're wearing, that violate the trust that they are given. We trust them with enforcing the laws, not in being selective about the laws that they are enforcing.
But you know, you're right. I attended the promotion ceremonies for law enforcement, and I can tell you that Commissioner Mueller and the police department, in listening to their message to the newly hired or promoted officers, is clearly focused on what we're talking about, that they need to, change and accept the times and deal with respect and deal with tolerance and so forth. But the same message that he said to you about, he wanted a police officer when they're doing an arrest or any situation to treat the person as if it was their son, daughter, mother, or father. I hear that from my brothers-in-law in the medical field. And what made them, I think, compassionate doctors is because, we lost my mother a month or so ago, and we grew up learning especially how to respect the elders and every individual. And their philosophy in medicine is treat every patient as if you're treating your mother or your brother or your sister or your father. And that goes for any profession. If you're a teacher, educate that child as if it's your child. And would you accept the education? Would you accept the health care? Would you expect a police officer to disrespect his or her family member? I think that's a message we need to echo, and that's a message that we need to bring to the level of reality. I agree with you. Enough lip service, enough of, trying to point the finger, enough. We understand there's a serious problem. Although there's been progress, we still unfortunately have a way to go. And if it took a massive, and in my opinion, and I agree with you, I love the fact that it's generated by a generation of youth. And as I said, when I look at every city, and I've tried to monitor, what I see and what the message is, it's a message that's loud and clear, that it's not just a message from African Americans. It's a message of all, especially young men and women of color and everyone, because I look at a very diversified protest makeup that to me sends a message that this is not, one segment of our society speaking up. This is America. This is a whole generation of America saying, we don't like what we see. And, does it mean parents have to wake up and realize that they got to educate their children? And if there is any discussions on the kitchen table or anywhere else that deal with, racial division or bigotry, that should be put to rest, that there should be in churches more sermons about diversity, no matter what the religion is, where the preacher gets up or the minister or the rabbi or the imam and talks about how all of us are children of God and each and every one of us needs to respect each other's differences and appreciate if it's a different culture or a different way of living. I've made it my business, and some people say, I've always enjoyed eating well because I consider myself international. I'd love to sample every ethnic dish. I'd love to listen to people's music and culture. And that's part of being maybe what I call globally aware, because the division that might have existed many years ago, Ru, especially with the internet and Facebook and communications, we're a global society now. So we gotta live and move with the changing times. And this is what this is all about.
Mr. Nader, I saw a billboard yesterday from Minneapolis. It said, "Can you hear us now? Can you hear us now?" I think now you and all the elected officials and those in power of changing laws can hear us loud and clear. But I also want to make a point that rioting to achieve your goals, it's wrong. Because once you riot, you burn, you vandalize, you burn police headquarters, you become the things that you are condemning. Now you are a criminal. Now a reaction from the police department might be undiscriminated. They just might go over everybody and people get hurt. So you will become exactly the things that you are condemning. Yes, we have the right to protest. We have the right to protest in peace. Yes, some civil disobedience, it's understood. You know what happened that they blocked the Sawmill Parkway? They made a statement and they left. Thanks to the police public spokesperson, Lieutenant Dean, did a great job. He spoke with the students. The students spoke back to him in a polite and according way, and they left. That's the way things are supposed to do. Going on cross county or McLean Avenue, flipping cars, burning cars, stealing, doing this, you are kind of, in a way, validating certain things. You are actually doing more harm than benefit the cause. So, we have to conclude this interview, but I want to conclude it from my part at least, saying thank you to those students that articulated their concerns in a peaceful way. They were heard much, much, much louder than those that decide to use violence to express whatever message they wanted to express. The message was lost in translation. We didn't understood, but we did understand the kids in Yonkers. Your last word, sir.
Yeah, Ru, I'm glad, of your statement. And you mentioned Lieutenant Dean. When you were live on the parkway there, during the march on the Parkway Sawmill southbound, I was listening live to you for at least half an hour, and watched how you put yourself in a position of trying to really get a sense of what was taking place. And I witnessed what you witnessed, and I even called the police commissioner the day after, Monday morning, and complimented Lieutenant Dean and said, you know what, Ru Ross was there at the scene, and I was watching what took place, and I appreciated the fact that Lieutenant Dean, who I've known for years through the precinct, and he gets very involved with community outreach and service, in my opinion, did an outstanding job. And he basically took control of the situation. And that's what police commanders need to learn from that experience, where he made sure his men and women officers behind him, were calm and collective. And he basically communicated with the protesters, respected their rights to protest. And I heard him telling the protesters, look, the reason I'm asking you can't block the parkway, there may be an ambulance, there may be a fire truck, it may impact. So, and there was reason there. So as we said earlier in the program, it's that type of education, it's that type of acknowledgement from law enforcement that they need to make sure, especially their people on the front lines, or their commanders, or the people that are, involved with, in this case, protests, are really individuals that understand their community, that are compassionate, that are realistic. Because what normally happens, you and I know from history, you got an egotistic person that demands, that his forces, whether it's military, and we spoke about police officers, many of them have military training, so do we have to understand that when we recruit a police officer in these days and times, maybe there should be policy that they should find out if they had military experience, maybe they need to be re-educated how to deal with society and community. It's not like fighting a military force on foreign grounds the way treatment is. And furthermore, if a new police officer or an existing police officer comes from another state or another community, another part of our state even, should we look into their backgrounds and find out if they had a history of bigotry or a history of injustice in their roles and duties? So these are the type of policies, I think, that are a combination that really allow us to educate, to inform, and preach and develop a new culture of law enforcement that's more compassionate, more community oriented, and more socially just. So we got to keep the message alive. But I agree with you that the protest, in my opinion, is separate from the vandalism and the looting, because even a few days ago, I heard an African-American gentleman from Minneapolis whose business was completely burnt, and listening to him cry out loud. This is an older gentleman, cry out loud to the protesters he was speaking to, that this is my business. Because I grew up in the ghetto. I worked all my life. Why did you burn my business down? So that aspect of it is wrong. We understand the anger that took place, but we have to be sensitive to the cause and not let what took place that might be very negative to be the driving force of how we react to this situation.
Well, I hope that the incident or the event, I'm not going to call it an incident, I'm going to call it an event, at Sawmill Parkway will be used by the police department for training purposes. Because that day, that event could have gone both ways.
Exactly.
But thanks to the de-escalation from Lieutenant Dean,
Correct.
it peacefully de-escalated and they went on their merry way. I've been doing this for about 12 years now, and I have seen many of the officers, I'm talking about the brass all the way on top, when they were lieutenants, Lieutenant Monaco, actually Commissioner Mueller when he was a captain. I have seen many of them act, and the top brass, I have to say, they cool-headed, they de-escalate, okay? And the first time I saw actually Chief Monaco engaging was on a park, not Park Avenue. In Park Avenue, we had a hostage situation. It was unbelievable, okay? But sometimes the lower police office, the low rank, they need a little bit more training, because very often the way they engage, sir, escalates instead of de-escalating the problem.
You're right.
Do you agree with me on that?
100%. I think like you said, you and I both witnessed that de-escalation, and I think it was ideal. And I made a point as a community member and as an assemblyman to reach out, as I said, to the police commissioner and really commend, so that the message was clear that, look, we as a community, we recognize, especially when your department and does something that's correct and outstanding, that, as you said, this should be a model. When I see an excellent lesson that a teacher teaches, I make it my point to say, you know what, let's bring other teachers to sit down and witness the way this teacher got the students involved and educated them where it was a perfect lesson. Same thing with law enforcement. They need to review the film, and they need to have tactical training of even basic skills. And as they do training now, when there's an emergency, I went to Westchester Medical Center to witness, there's a team in the county that deals with medical emergencies, God forbid, an earthquake, a plane crash, something serious. And they have role models. They have actors that are bleeding there, that are sitting, and it was meant to train students, residents and students, how do you address a serious problem? You know, I would make it mandatory for law enforcement, you know, to approve a curriculum that includes similar training where you have to go through this intensive training. And like medical and law and other professions where you have continuous legal education or medical education, you know, where you're required on a regular basis to keep updating your learning and your skills and your knowledge. This should be the case with law enforcement. And similar to the film you're talking about that you're involved with, that should be part of the training here. This could have been a serious problem. Look at the way this commander involved of this situation handled it.
You know, Mr. Nader, I was talking with one of the police officers the other day about a particular incident that happened in Yonkers. And this is what the police officer told me, and I'm going to quote him exactly. He said, "Ru, you should not be part of the story. You should just report of the story." And my answer to him was, you know what? Sometimes we don't have options. Sometimes the story drags us in. Just like the story dragged me in on the Sawmill Parkway. I didn't go there with the intent of being the story, but I was involved in the story because I love my community. I support my police department. I'm not saying again that they are perfect. No, they are not perfect. Commissioner himself has said that they are not perfect. And like a wise man once told me, it's not important to find perfection. What's important is to keep seeking perfection.
Well said, well said. And we think alike. So I think, you know, it's great that a situation this difficult, you know, will always be in the forefront. And it should always be in the forefront. And whether it's through Hollywood or the making of movies or the making of policy or the, as I said earlier, sending a message that gets the religious institutions on board, the cultural, the civic organizations. We need to expand the effort that these young men and women, predominantly college-age students, that really took to the streets and expressed a very important component that impacts our entire nation and hopefully makes us move forward and bring about more justice and more equality and honestly more respect for what I consider to be a basic human right. You know, so programs like this help us to express our points and to really hopefully bring about good examples, good initiatives, and to continue our efforts in speaking to law enforcement and other individuals involved, and to really, whether it requires change in policy or focusing more on changing attitudes or perspectives, you know, to really keep the mission alive. So I want to, you know, thank you publicly, Ru, because you're there in the forefront, as they say, and you're addressing very important, crucial issues.
On that note, Mr. Nader, let me just clear something up to those who are watching. I cannot keep everybody happy. Some people like, some people don't, but that's life, okay? But one thing that I want people to understand that I created this not to be a spokesperson for the police. They don't need me to be a spokesperson for the police. I'm not here for the community. At the same time, I am here for the community. But on top of all, I'm here to give you the news of the things that happen on the street in Yonkers in a raw way. I don't write long articles. I just give you the date, the time, the place, and what. Watch, listen to what I'm saying, to my narration like you did. And by my narration on the video, you get the conclusion of what's going on. Don't rely just on that headline, on that caption. The caption is just general information of what's going on. What's really happening, it's on the video. Listen to the details, listen to what I'm saying, and you will understand what's going on. With that, on that note, Mr. Nader, thank you very much for taking the time, and hopefully I will see you next week if there is anything going on now that you have. Thank you, son. Until next time.
Thank you very much. Bye, Ru.
Bye-bye.